Welcome to the Knitted Bible exhibition. We have borrowed these 36 knitted scenes from St George's URC in Hartlepool, who knitted them beginning in 2008. They started by knitting the Last Supper and just kind of carried on. But they're a wonderful sweep of the whole Bible as we'll follow it through. We begin at the beginning with the story of creation. The whole world, the whole universe made wonderful and amazing and beautiful. God created all this wonderful world and it was amazing, but somehow things went wrong. Most Christians don't read these stories literally, but there is truth in them about how we relate to the natural world and to one another and to God. God asks the first people to take care of the earth. I wonder how you feel about that responsibility for us today. We often think of the Bible being full of stories of heroes, people to admire and to copy in our own lives. But so many of them were actually very deeply flawed. And we read about families where there were arguments and disagreements. We have Abraham and Sarah. Abraham fell out with his nephew Lot. We have Jacob, who in this story here we can see he was running away from his family because he had fallen out with his brother. And then we have Joseph and all of his brothers who did not get on. People argue and fight, and so sometimes they have to go their separate ways. And yet, through all this story, we hear that God never leaves them. And that can encourage us to recognise that God is always with us too. It's not always possible to be reconciled to those we've fallen out with, but eventually these families do. Jacob makes peace with his twin brother Esau, and Joseph forgives the brothers who sold him as a slave. I wonder if you need God's help in any of your relationships, or is there somebody else that you want to ask God to help? So many of the stories we read and those that are shown here seem to be mostly about men, but this is the story of Moses here, and actually his life was shaped by the actions of some very defiant women. There were midwives who refused to kill him at birth as they'd been asked to. His mother was prepared to take risks, and his sister took care of him and also was very courageous. And it was the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter that saved him as he grew up in her home, with a passion for justice that got him into difficulty in his life when he tried to save someone from their Egyptian slave master, and he actually murdered somebody. But later, God would use that same passion to free the people of Israel from captivity. For generations, they'd been slaves, used like cogs in a machine. But now that they were free, God needed to show them how to be human again. So he gave them the 10 Commandments to show them how to live. This was the best way to be. People, of course, still are experiencing slavery and oppression today in all sorts of places, and sometimes taking great risks to try and reach freedom. I wonder what responsibility we have to help them and what we can do to make a difference. The wonderful thing is that God always has a rescue plan and often asks some very surprising people to be part of it. Samson was a strong man with a weakness for women. Samuel was a small child when he first heard God speak. And David was just the messenger boy when he volunteered to fight the giant Goliath. None of them lived perfect lives. And yet each of them found that they were called by God and had important things to do for God. I wonder what surprises you've had in your life. Have you ever ended up in surprising places or with responsibilities you didn't expect? When you look back, do you have any sense of God being at work in what you have experienced? God's rescue plan is often not very comfortable. The prophets brought all sorts of challenging messages and often asked people to do difficult things. Daniel knew that he needed to keep on praying to God even when the king made a law against it that put his life in danger. And Jonah didn't even want to be a prophet, and he tried to run away. But no one can run away from God. God gave Jonah another chance to do the right thing. Have you ever found it hard to do the right thing? Even if we don't quite get things right, God always offers a fresh start. If there's something weighing you down now, talk to God about it and listen for what God might have to say to you. God's ultimate rescue plan was the biggest surprise of all. A young, unmarried woman from a simple home was invited to become the mother of God's anointed one, the Word of God, by whom everything was created. He was born a tiny, wordless baby, crying to be fed. He wasn't rich or powerful in the normal human way, and yet he would change the world forever. I wonder if you had the power to do anything and you wanted to create a plan to save the world from all that is wrong in it, how would you do it? How do you think your plan compares to God's plan? Why did God choose to become human? Now we have 3 stories all connected by water. The first is the very beginning of Jesus' ministry when he was baptised by his cousin John in the Jordan River. I wonder if you have any thoughts about why Jesus was baptised. Jesus' first miracle was at a wedding when the wine ran out, and he told the servant to draw water from the big jars of water for washing, and it had become the best wine. Those jars held about the same amount as 600 to 900 wine bottles. Why would Jesus provide such an enormous quantity of wine? The longest conversation written in the Gospels is between Jesus and a woman from Samaria. Not only was it surprising that he was speaking with a woman, but Jews didn't mix with Samaritans. But Jesus had a long and deep theological conversation with her about living water and true worship and the identity of the Messiah and the work of God's Holy Spirit. I wonder if you could have a conversation with Jesus now, what would you want to talk about? Taken together, what do all these 3 stories have to say to us about God? People often made assumptions about who Jesus would want to spend his time with. Jesus' friends assumed that he would be too busy to bother with a group of children that their parents had brought to him. No one thought he should be spending time with a tax collector, Zacchaeus, who was, after all, working for the Romans, who were the enemies. He climbed a tree so that he could try and see Jesus, and Jesus invited him for tea. And when Jesus went for a meal at the home of Mary and Martha, Mary wanted to sit with the men and learn from Jesus, but her sister thought that she should be helping with the housework. But Jesus had time for all of these people, and he challenged the discrimination of the culture and welcomed women and children and all kinds of outcasts and spent time with them. Who might we assume that Jesus doesn't have time for today? Are there people that we don't have time for? I wonder why that might be. All 4 of these stories are about people giving what they have or doing what they can to help others. For some of them, it didn't seem like very much. This was a poor widow who had given a couple of small coins into the temple treasury, and Jesus pointed her out and said she had given all that she had. Here is a story that Jesus told, which you're probably familiar with, the parable of the Good Samaritan, about a man who helped someone who'd been attacked on the road and took care of him. And here's a story about 4 friends who cared for a friend of theirs who was paralysed, and they wanted to bring him to Jesus, but the crowds were so big they couldn't get him into the house. So they climbed up on the roof and made a hole and lowered him down through the hole in the roof until he was right in front of Jesus. And then the 4th story is about when Jesus was with a whole crowd of people who were hungry, and the disciples wanted to give them something to eat or send them away. And Jesus asked how much food did they have. and a small child brought his lunch, some loaves and fishes, and Jesus used those given to him to feed a huge crowd of 5,000 people. I wonder what you have to give. What does it mean to you to be a good neighbour to others? How might God use what you offer to do more than you could ever imagine? Another story that Jesus told was about a shepherd who would leave all his other sheep behind in order to look for the one that had got lost. And Jesus said that he was the good shepherd, willing to die for the sheep. He said that he came to give life, life in all its fullness. And then he lived that out in stories of people that he healed. There are so many stories of Jesus healing people and bringing them their fullness of life. And here is the story of Jairus' daughter, who he went to make better when she was unwell. And everybody said she died, but Jesus took her by the hand and she was well again. And then another story of Jesus raising Lazarus to life. His friend Lazarus had died and he'd even been buried in the tomb for 4 days. But Jesus told them to open the tomb and Lazarus came out. There are so many stories like this. What do you make of these stories of healing? Where do you long to see life in all its fullness? Is there anything you want to ask Jesus for? Having seen all the wonderful things that Jesus had done, his friends had great hopes that he was going to free them from Roman rule. He entered Jerusalem and was welcomed by huge crowds waving palm branches and welcoming him into the city. But those excited crowds slipped away, and Jesus began to speak of his death. On the night before he died, he shared a meal with his friends, and at the table he gave them bread and wine and said that these were his body and blood. That night, as they prayed in the garden, Jesus was arrested and he was tried and condemned to death. The next day he was taken out to be crucified. He was executed alongside the criminals with him. I wonder if there's ever been a time in your life when hopes of wonderful things have faded and everything seemed to go wrong. I wonder how you got through that. The first Easter day was a confusing time. Jesus' friends went to the tomb to care for his body, and then they found it empty, and an angel there telling them that Jesus had risen. Later that day, 2 friends met a stranger on the road, and they didn't recognise him. They didn't realise it was Jesus walking beside them and helping them to make sense of everything until they got to the place where they were staying that night and they sat down to eat, and Jesus broke bread with them, and suddenly they recognised who it was. Another time, Jesus' friends had gone fishing again, back to what they knew. But then suddenly they realised there was a figure on the beach. It was Jesus. He was there waiting for them with breakfast, a fire and some fish being cooked over it. Do you think that Jesus is present with us in the world today? I wonder how we recognise his presence among us. Most people know the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, but did you know there's also a story of Jesus feeding the 4,000? And Jesus talks about both of them and how people really should be understanding some of what he'd come to do. Again, on this occasion, he asked for what food they had, and they had a few loaves and a few fish, and they shared them, and they fed so many people. Jesus invites us to find ourselves in the crowd of his friends and followers. I wonder, can you see yourself here? And what difference would it make to you?